Great. Hello, and welcome to Canada's History Spring Webinar Series. This series revolves around visual history. Over the next few months, we will hear from educators, public historians, and graphic designers who will speak about their experiences using visuals to share Canadian history. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I will be your host for the series. This afternoon, Dr. Samantha Cottrera will focus on how, by providing access to primary sources, institutions such as archives, museums, and libraries can engage young people in social justice work that can have a benefit to how they view the past, present, and the future. Before we begin today's presentation, I would like to give you a quick introduction to Canada's National History Society. Canada's history is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through our publishing, education, and recognition programs. Our flagship publications are Canada's History Magazine and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids. You can see those two links on the screen. The text is hyperlinked. You can go ahead and click on those if you're interested in learning more about them, and if you're interested in subscribing also. Each year, Canada's History recognizes excellence and honors the achievements of history makers and enthusiasts of all ages, predominantly through the Governor-General's History Awards and the Government of Canada History Awards. We would like you to know about these opportunities. So you can also see the links on the screen there. You'll notice the deadline for the Governor-General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. The deadline is tomorrow. So if you started that application but forgot to finish it, better get on it. Otherwise, for the Government of Canada History Awards, you have a little bit more time to even start an application if you haven't already. To ensure the best experience possible today, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer is running, just to give Adobe Connect a little bit more support and providing you a flawless experience. However, like I mentioned earlier, if there are issues with your experience today, technical-wise, there will be a recording of today's webinar available in a few days. If you are on social media, please spread the word about our conversation today. I have included Canada's History's Twitter handle and Facebook link on the screen that you can open up and comment, tweet at, and the like. And I'm sure Samantha would share hers as well in the chat box if she has those social media accounts. If there are any questions during today's webinar, you are welcome to ask them at any time, and Samantha will answer them as she sees fit. I do know we are expecting to have a nice Q&A at the end, but don't feel like you have to withhold your questions until then, especially if you might have to dip out a bit early. Definitely share them with us sooner rather than later. So without further ado, with a PhD from York University in Education and a focus on meaningful learning in Canadian history education, Dr. Samantha Cottrera has become an expert in her field of teaching and learning history in both traditional and non-traditional sites of education, such as classrooms, museums, and archives. As a history education strategist, Dr. Cottrera developed strategies, projects, and programs to help organizations and individuals teach Canadian history in interesting, meaningful, and comprehensive ways. This has been done by writing curriculum and creating resources, leading professional development sessions for educators, developing exhibits and related programming, and building partnerships and community amongst organizations and individuals. Today, Dr. Cottrera will explore and give examples for 3 ways institutions can think of their work as in the service of social justice. So without further ado, I will upload Dr. Cottrera's PowerPoint and she will take it away.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Oh, yes, yes. Just okay. Great. Wonderful. So thank you so much for having me today. It's so great to be able to be a part of this series for Canada's history, especially this awesome series in visual history, because I often like using images and exploring images with the different groups I work with and with the students. And it's so great that there were so many people that were interested in this presentation. And I don't know if you are necessarily coming from museum backgrounds or archive backgrounds or teachers in a traditional classroom, but I will be talking about elements and pedagogy that can fit into all of those different ways of practicing. Can anyone not hear me? Or they need me to speak up at all before I kind of launch? No, I'm great. Well, thank you. This is going to be a really great way to start then. I'm going to use the web camera function a little bit, but sorry, I'm just looking at the chat thing. I'm going to use the web camera function for a little bit, but mainly for the Q&A. Can you see me right now for the web function? Can you see me? Yeah, oh, great. Well, hi, everyone. I usually start a presentation by being like, welcome, but right now it's like, welcome to my office space and living room. It's, like I said, it's great to be here today. My background, I've been doing this work for about 20 years. Which kind of starts with my teens, just, full disclosure. Some of you might know me. I worked at the Archives of Ontario as a senior coordinator of education and exhibitions for about 2.5 years. I left there in December 2014, 2015 to write a book based on my doctoral research. The book is called Creating Possibilities, Meaningful Learning in Canadian History Education. So this presentation today will focus on the elements of my book and my doctoral research, my work at the archives, but the work at the archives the Archives of Ontario was similar to the work that I've done at Black Creek Pioneer Village, various different university grants and community groups through those grants. I worked at the Dominion Institute. So this experience I'll be talking about is a range of different experiences. So I also have a hyperlink. When I go back to my slides, you'll see my website or a hyperlink to my website on my name. My website is Samantha Cutrara, CUTRARA.com. On that website, under current projects, you can actually download these slides as well as a note-taking sheet for the slides if that's interesting or helpful for you. Okay, I'll switch back to the presentation and we'll get started. All right, so this presentation is called Using Primary Sources as a Form of Social Justice. And when we're talking about social justice, there's many different ways to kind of think about it. But this idea of visualizing different paths and imagining different futures is the core of how I understand social justice. So a definition of social justice that you can find on Wikipedia, but it's actually a real definition, is the way in which human rights are manifested in the everyday lives of people at every level of society. Now, oftentimes when we are talking about social justice, we think about this idea of human rights. But I want to bring your attention to the other part of that definition, which is the everyday lives of people. And I think sometimes when we do social justice work that we want to do such big projects that we forget that acknowledging the everyday lives of people and acknowledging how people interact and what's the word I'm looking for, negotiate their everyday lives. Acknowledging that is also a form of social justice. It's not just about ensuring accessibility, although of course that's very, very important, but just acknowledging everyday lives is a key part of social justice. As an educator and a strategist, I recognize that social justice and teaching learning is recognizing that young people are interested in learning history. We often don't think that. We often assume that young people don't know history or not that interested in history. But over and over and over, I have found that we, as educators, as historians, as archivists, as teachers, we don't have to convince young people that history is important. Instead, our role is to make history important enough for them to learn. Because, as one student said who I've worked with, we come to class to get educated, and you're going to have to bring it to the table. And this particular student that I worked with that said that was failing a lot of her classes. But here she was acknowledging that the role that education can play in her future, but how she felt like this was not being accounted for in her classes. This is our challenge, not theirs. It's not their challenge in order to figure out what we have brought to the table. It is our challenge in order to bring stuff to the table which connects with students. And this comes from an ethos of social justice. It comes from an ethos of recognizing students as smart, capable, community-oriented people who are interested in the future. And my least favorite phrase is, well, kids these days, X, Y, and Z. But the fact is, coming in with an ethos, a spirit of belief in students is one of the most foundational things that we can do for bringing social justice to our educational spaces. Whether that is a traditional classroom, whether that is your programming at an archives, or whether that is your exhibits in a museum. This is especially important when we're talking about images in history and visual history, because students, along with a lot of other people, understand history by images, by the visualization of history, the past as an image. And again, while we think, oh, students don't know this, students don't know that, they're surrounded by images on a constant basis that actually teach them narratives. They teach them that our prime ministers are old white guys. They teach us that that war and acknowledging our veterans are important. They see the combination of settlers and First Nations people through just a series of images. And that's really important to remember, because when students come into a classroom, even if they can't articulate it, these are the things they already know. And if we are going to move forward in thinking of our work in terms of social justice, then we have to be able to validate what they know first. Now, I talk a lot about meaningful learning, and for me, meaningful learning is a key part of social justice. I have defined meaningful learning as history education that has significance to students' lives now and in the future, both inside and outside of the classroom, and framed with interpretations of the past that align with the student's sense of familial or community history in and for the wider world. This definition of meaningful learning means it's not just students, although most of us already know this, it's not just students getting the answers right on the test, but integrating that knowledge into their own narratives to be able to challenge the things that they might not know or they have wrong, but also contextualizing and making even more important the stuff that they do know. In other words, meaningful learning is providing complex and connected history to students. And if we take this seriously, if we take meaningful learning seriously, if we take bringing in complex and connected histories to students seriously, then what we're doing is already working in the spirit, in the ethos of social justice. Meaningful learning involves three things. It involves connection to prior knowledge, it involves meaningful material, and it involves the assent of the learner. That means the students have to make the choice to learn. Because while we can talk a lot about what can ensure that students learn, At the end of the day, the students can only learn something if they make the choice to. We can teach, but we can't make them learn. What we can do when we teach is provide them with as much unconditional learning opportunities and invitations so that they feel safe and connected to the knowledge that we are providing. Even and especially if this knowledge is new or complicated or maybe contentious. This definition comes from a cognitive theory background. Joseph Novak, David Ausubel. This work comes from 1960s traditional cognitive theory, which might sound kind of the opposite of social justice, even though both of these theorists actually discuss social justice in kind of implicit ways in their work. But these three elements of meaningful learning can also be found in radical theorists' work, such as bell hooks and Paulo Freire. They talk about meeting people where they are, bringing in knowledge that connects with people, doing a posing approach. Oh, excuse me, it's good. I'm not going to say that too many times today. A problem posing approach, and it's okay, you know what I'm talking about, in which the student becomes part of the process of learning. So if you're not necessarily that comfortable with 1960s cognitive theory for whatever reason, know that this is also comes from radical theory as well. So this idea of prior knowledge, meaningful material, and the assent of the learner, it's straightforward, but when you start to think about it, it's actually more complex. So in terms of prior knowledge, that means that we acknowledge what students know. This could be false. They could have false information, but we need to acknowledge what they know. A student doesn't necessarily need to know all the details of every battle of World War I to know that it was a war, to know that it involved many different countries around the world, to know that there were soldiers that fought, to know that those soldiers were most likely male, to know that if they were male soldiers fighting, that means that there were families left at home. And they know that most of these soldiers are white. So without even knowing many details about World War I, by acknowledging these things that people know, we're already starting at a place that respects the learner as a learner, and then we can build off of that. Students have an implicit understanding of narrative myths, and adults often don't give them credit enough for this. But kind of, beating the bushes, which is not a great expression, but beating the bushes about what they know, to be able to start articulating it, allows new knowledge to start being scaffolded onto this old knowledge. Meaningful material is just that. It is material that is meaningful. But what actually counts as meaningful material, or what meaningful is, depends on the educator, depends on the students. And in this presentation, I'll be focusing on ways to rethink and explore this idea of meaningful material with your collections or with the primary sources that you have in your classrooms already. And then the assent of the learner. So again, that's acknowledging students as responsible, respected individuals that are there in a community to co-create knowledge. I can't stress this enough, how important thinking of your students as smart individuals as soon as they enter the spaces where you'll be teaching is the foundation for any sort of meaningful learning social justice work. Now, of course, when we talk about social justice and visuals, these types of standard images that demonstrate oppression and activism or exclusion, these are often the visuals that people think of right away. And I'm actually going to, of course, these are great to use, but I'm going to move beyond this a little bit. And just before I begin talking about those three things that Jessica had mentioned when we started this presentation, I just want to acknowledge that while I've been working with transnational feminist anti-racist theory for 20 years, I recognize that sometimes institutions aren't necessarily comfortable with doing explicit social justice work. What I'll be talking about today are ways that you can do this implicitly as well as explicitly. You can bring this into your classroom through an ethos. And when I say classroom, I mean in any sort of traditional or non-traditional sites of learning, which might include a website or a Flickr album, photo album. In order to be able to do this in ways that are comfortable for your institution. Of course, it's important that we're always pushing the boundaries of what makes us comfortable, especially if we have a lot of privilege in society. However, I recognize that there's a theory called interest conversion. To do radical work, those interests need to converge with dominant narratives. So I just want to throw that out there in case it's already sort of an uncomfortable thing for you. So the three ways that institutions can think of their work as social justice work, or to think of their work in the service of social justice, is one, to introduce students to new faces, places, and experiences, otherwise flattened in traditional history and social studies lessons. Two, giving students a chance to bear witness to the ordinary lives of Canadians. Three, breaking down traditional relationships between student-teacher, teacher-student, practitioner and teacher, student-practitioner. So when I say practitioner, I might mean an archivist, I might mean a museum interpreter, etc. So I'm going to talk about these three things in turn by showing images from various different collections. So first, by introducing students to new faces, places, and experience that otherwise get flattened in a traditional history or social studies lesson, primary sources can provide evidence of the multiplicity of people and experiences in the past. Now, when we teach history, even when we want to teach it in really interesting, creative, active ways, we often really focus on historical periods. A historic space, if you will, that is really just a contextual or a conceptual understanding of a historical period. We have particular names and dates we want to make sure that students know. We want to kind of frame that traditional narrative. And I call these historic spaces because it is a space. Often these historical periods are separated from other historical periods. And even if you want to do interesting social justice work, a lot of people are like, we need to make sure they know all the stuff first. But when we talk about historic spaces, we're able to differentiate those historical periods by just saying, okay, we're going to spend 5 minutes or an hour or a lesson making sure you know all the highlighted main names and dates. But then what we can do is start bringing in images that say, look, these people were there. We were there. We as Canadians. We can think so much when we're talking about Canadian history, us versus them. But the fact is, Canada is a we. People in Canada, people that associate with Canada, we are a we. So we were there. We were there working together. We were there building communities together. We were there working there together, and we were there building Canada together. Sometimes we were there in very oppressive circumstances. We don't know any sort of background to this particular image, but oftentimes people will say, oh, if it's a studio portrait of First Nations people, it was set up to look a particular way and it demonstrates colonialism, and that's all very true, but it also demonstrates that they were there. We were there. This is what tradition looks like. This is not rewriting the narrative. This is not creating Canada as the same type of multicultural Canada that we now know. But this is actually saying they were there. We were there. there was a different type of multiculturalism in Canada, and whether it was one person or multiple people, by acknowledging these people in history, we are rewriting a white supremacist narrative or a patriarchal narrative or a capitalist narrative that says that these people were not there in the same way that we now know them. Because sometimes the prior knowledge that students have, or adults have, or people have, is that people were absent, that we were not part of the past, or they were not part of the past. What is particularly great about this image is this date right here. Oh, where's my thing? Can I move it? Oh, there we go. There's a date right here that says 1907, 1910. So if you're using an image like this in a workshop, you're actually inviting students to recognize that I'm not just telling you that it's around 1910. This was actually marked on there itself. Just to note that all of these images are also hyperlinked back to the Flickr accounts of the different archives I got them from. When we talk about they were there and we were there, what we're doing is we're blending our historical narratives to discuss tradition and present and negotiation and development. We're showing that, that Canadian history continues to move, even though it's not just this idea of we're going to bring in a few Black students and a few Asian students. We were there, they were there. We're broadening what us and them actually look like. And by broadening what us and them look like, we develop this new understanding of what we look like as Canadians, and what we look like as Canadians now, and what we can develop as our Canadian identity to move forward into the future. When we say they were there, we can use these images to demonstrate. We can demonstrate service. We can demonstrate travel. Because our lives are not held within these national borders. They are transnational. If you were a soldier serving in World War I, you probably went overseas. And if you went overseas, you brought back ideas about overseas. Even if you were a First Nations person that spent the beginning of their life living on a reserve. By bringing in ordinary pictures of small, precious moments of life, what we are saying is that these experiences that we have now have continued from a tradition. They look similar, they look different, but we were there to do this. When we think of this, when we bring in new faces and places, what we do is we put a face on labor. We put a face on the work behind the work that we see now. And sometimes this labor actually didn't really have much of a face at the time. Sometimes it was background labor. Sometimes it was labor of people that you never saw because they worked in kitchens. But while this is not necessarily a revolutionary picture, with a spirit, with an ethos, that this can be a revolutionary picture by just acknowledging that work. To show integration, to show that these are not watertight categories of male, female, Black, white, First Nations, European, that these are a multiplicity of experiences. They were there, we were there. And it's to show that they were there too. I'm going to just use they for this one, I think. To show that they were there too. It hasn't always been easy, and that it has been a struggle. To highlight changes of our policies, to highlight changes of our populations, but also just to demonstrate that it hasn't always been about struggle. Sometimes just showing teenagers dancing demonstrates that it's about connection and community and fun, as well as the difficult parts of life, which we also often associate with social justice work in traditional and non-traditional sites of education. We can bring in images to challenge gender roles. This is a surgery studio, and we often talk about men as doctors and women being subjugated. That's true. Women, for the most part, were nurses and orderlies, but there were only 2 men in this photograph. We're able to challenge this idea of gender by seeing, in fact, there were different, that there were people there. There were people there and working. We can also challenge ideas of class and race in order to say it's not just about, for example, Black folks that migrated as refugees to Canada in the 19th century to escape slavery, but communities that have been in Canada for decades, for centuries. When we think about they were there and we were there, and that bringing in these ideas of challenging traditional narratives, what we do is we refocus the images that we're using to show that the they and the we is actually a part of the Canadian narrative. We refocus the narratives to look at the people we don't necessarily see, because we can often say they were the only one there, so let's just focus on the class dynamics in this photograph. But when we think about they were the only one there, or they were in a marginalized job, what we do is we solidify the embodiment of absence. But this man that is serving in this photograph, he's not absent, he's very present. Even though it might be a difficult image for some because it demonstrates servitude, not servitude, but service in the face of racial and class dynamics, by acknowledging that this work and that this was important work for a lot of people that led to the Rail Brotherhood of Railway Workers Union, by acknowledging that this type of work, we are making our traditional narratives from something flattened to something complex. But it takes that ethos, it takes believing that this photograph can be a photograph that demonstrates social justice, in the fact that we just acknowledge that people were there. The second thing that we can do to use visual images in our education programs or our teaching generally in the surface of social justice is by giving a people a chance to bear witness to the ordinary lives of Canadians. Primary sources can democratize the past in ways that invite students to imagine their ordinary selves and their experiences as having potential importance when viewed as part of a larger narrative. So when students look at a textbook, they often see premiers and prime ministers, and they recognize that those people are important because they are part of the textbook. I'm not putting textbooks down, because textbooks can actually do this work of visualizing the past. Because when we're talking about using our work in the service of social justice, it's about interpretation, right? So I'm not putting textbooks down. When students see images in the textbooks of ordinary Canadians, we can also solidify for them that they've become important by being a part of the textbook. Students know this implicitly. They might not be able to articulate it, but they know this implicitly. So when we bring in photographs of ordinary people, that we include everyday photographs as important for learning history, what we do is we privilege this status. We take our status of, it's normally just the important people that get represented, and we say that everyone is important once we represent them. Everyone. We can make all lives extraordinary by privileging them in our teaching and learning. Even just kind of ordinary things that students are familiar with. Playing music, hanging out with their friends. This photograph is amazing, by the way. Doing things that they would be familiar with in terms of going to the movies, but also challenging how this looks different than the movies that they go to. And just spending time with friends. When we bring this into our teaching and learning, we're saying to our students, when you hang out with your friends, it can also be kind of extraordinary if we interpret it that way. One of the images that I liked to use when I worked at the archives were these images of a 13-year-old girl's diary. Now, 13-year-old girls kind of get a bad rap throughout history, right? No one really thinks of them as that important unless they do something crazy important. But by bringing images like this into our teaching and learning, we can actually say when a 13-year-old girl is drawing pictures of fashions or drawing pictures of her teachers, when we look back at this work and we interpret it as important for a narrative, the narrative that we are creating, then we are acknowledging that the 13-year-old girls in our class, or the 13-year-old boys, or people that recognize these experiences can also be a part of the past. And at the Archives of Ontario, when I was the Senior Coordinator of Education and Exhibitions, I developed an exhibition strategy which focused on the ordinary lives of soldiers and their loved ones back home during World War I. The exhibit, Dear Sadie, Love, Lives, and Remembrance from Ontario's First World War, is a traveling exhibit, is an on-site exhibit at the Archives of Ontario, as well as an online exhibit, so you can see all these images. But what we did was, even though this is a white man, you know, their narratives are often pretty much covered in our normal history textbooks. By bringing in his letters and the letters from his girlfriend as well, what we do is we just take this ordinary conversation and we develop an extraordinary effect from it. We develop a space where students can read and interpret and think about other people's lives in relationship to their own lives. And one example that I really love was that when I was running a program with a student when I worked there, this one student said, "Oh my God, miss, it's so funny how Harry is like, oh, Sadie, how come you don't text me back?" And Sadie's like, "Dude, I'm at the movies. Stop writing me all the time." I love this example because it is very easy for an educated woman such as myself to say to the student, "You know they weren't texting, right?" And if I had said that, then that connection that student had made would have just gone down the drain. The student then answered like, "Oh, I know they weren't texting." But to me, that was such an important part of that conversation because it demonstrated he was making a connection to this history, this ordinary history. And this was a very successful exhibit. It's still very successful. When I believe that it's still a waiting list to get the traveling exhibit. You can visit it at the Archives of Ontario. You can go online. It got a lot of press. These were not special people. They were ordinary people. But what we did was, as a social justice ethos, we privilege those stories to explore how these ordinary stories can actually be quite extraordinary. And our final one, with just a few minutes left, by breaking down the traditional relationships between student-teacher, teacher-student, practitioner-teacher, student-practitioner, what we can do is that we can understand all parties as participating in exploring, inquiring, and co-creating meaning of sources and how they fit into and perhaps challenge one's understanding of the past. What this means is that we can take images and just ask students, what do you see? Because how they answer that is colored by their experiences. How I would answer that is colored by my experiences. And as you know, in the archival and museum community, etc., the descriptions of images are based on the accessioning standards that were available at the time. So this particular photograph is called Portrait of an Aboriginal Man. The more I look at this photograph and the more I talk to people that are part of First Nations communities or part of Métis communities or Inuit communities, it becomes apparent that perhaps this is not an Aboriginal man, perhaps this is actually a Métis man. He might have identified as Aboriginal or a part of a First Nations, but this scarf right here makes me think that it might be someone part of a Métis community. But if we just put this image out, we can start that conversation in a way we couldn't necessarily if we just say, okay, students, here's the photograph, let's move on. We can bring in images and ask students to think about, what do you see here that's similar or different? What are things that you see here that is what you expect and what you don't expect? What are the meanings of some of these things that you see? And then we can also challenge what we see. We can talk about the fact that we look at Viola Desmond as a super important person in the history of civil rights in Canada, and the new Historica Heritage Minute on her is amazing. But then by looking at archival material, different artifacts, we can kind of question that she was used to sell whitening products, and what that means for the history of civil rights movement if they were ratifying an understanding of race that was that privileged lighter skin and whiter people. By inviting students' interpretations and teachers' interpretations as valid, you're providing them with the opportunity to respect and recognize their own worth in thinking about, interpreting, and understanding the past. That's really important because, again, it's about making that choice, unconditional teaching, meaningful learning, recognizing that they have a worth in interpreting the past. So you can do this with these traditional images, but you don't necessarily need to. As I hope I've demonstrated with this presentation, you can do it with very, very ordinary images, because it's the spirit of social justice, of acknowledging the everydayness of every day that's important. Archival material and artifacts can help present a different story, because different stories force a new way to think about history. And new ways of thinking about history invite us to imagine new ways to think about the future. I'm ending my presentation with this particular image because I have no information about it. I got it at a flea market in British Columbia when I was there for a day. But every time I look at this particular image, I learn more about the history of Canada by just staring at it, by thinking about what these lives were like, these ordinary, ordinary lives. With these three areas that I've talked about in this presentation and bringing this ethos into your programming, your work with young people can introduce them to your visual collections that you have and can be in the service of and inspire social justice and activism work. And that type of thing is what makes education meaningful. And that's what makes the possibilities apparent in history. So thank you very much. More information about my work can be found on my website, SamanthaCotrera.com. I do consulting work if you ever wanted to continue this conversation formally. However, a lot of the different things that I've written are also available online for informal. I'm pretty sure I went over my time a little bit, but we still have time for questions. So I'm very excited to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Samantha. That was a great presentation. I can definitely relate to how giving students the confidence in the classroom really lets their creativity show, and sometimes that brings critical comments and that you've never thought of before, or they see something in an image you haven't seen before, and that learning experience for an educator, for someone like myself, it's a spectacular moment. So thank you.
I agree. No problem.
It makes so much sense, everything you said, and sometimes we need to hear it again and more clearly and have the guidelines to include this in our classrooms and in our places of education. So I do welcome everybody to share their questions as I am speaking now with Samantha. I do have a few questions to start things going. So now that I don't see any, I'm going to ask a few, and Samantha, feel free to answer the questions that come up as they do, even if that requires interrupting the answer to my question.
Okay.
So I'm wondering a few things. So specifically thinking about an institution that has limited programming resources, how can they start this work without an investment in a full-time educational programmer?
That's a really great question, because that's what a lot of people wind up being afraid about. I don't necessarily have these resources. So the first thing is that it's, again, about the spirit of the images that you want to explore with young people, and to be able to bring those to young people and to other educators. And maybe what that means is just finding 5 really great images and using a platform, a free platform like Flickr, just to put that out there and ask a couple questions about what do you see here? How is this inspiring? How is this familiar to your life? How is this different from your life? That type of way is minimal sort of resource development, and really allows that idea of bringing other people into the mix for interpretation. Also, if you have limited resources to hire a full-time person, you could hire a consultant for various different services. I happen to know of one. It's me. Again, you can go on my website for more information about that. I see questions here, so let me go up here. Oh gosh, so many awesome questions. If I don't get to all your questions today, I will answer them. I will type out the answers and put them on my website. Okay. So I'm going to read the questions in order. I edit Kayak, our kids' history magazine. Great resource. I have a copy behind me. Given your background working with the archives, do you have any tips for asking researchers to look for some of these less familiar images? So oftentimes what I would do at the Archives of Ontario when I worked there was I would type in like crazy random search terms like sun, like S-U-N, just to see what comes up. This I'm obviously talking about a database that's available. And in doing that, it would be crazy what would come up, because sometimes things had to do with the sun, sometimes it didn't. But often I would get these really interesting images that wouldn't just come up if I typed in like child, right? And in looking at the images that are available with these kind of random search terms, then you can start seeing history differently according to the 3 ways that I've talked about today. Another way is, again, just to alter the narrative a little bit in how you interpret these images. So I found an old stereo photograph of, a traditional white middle-class family in the 19th century. Nothing particularly revolutionary about that, except that one of the men, which it seemed like it was a son, S-O-N, in that photograph, was actually like staring longingly at another person in the photograph. And just asking students to kind of think about that, different standards of gender, what it meant to be a man and a woman, allows those kind of interesting things to come up. Okay, second question. How do we use archival materials for social justice if the archival materials are severely restricted by privacy? That's a really great question, and would come up a lot at the Archives of Ontario. And I should say I'm not an archivist, I'm an educator. My background's in education, so I worked with great people at the archives that taught me as many archival standards as I could bear. Sorry. Yeah, privacy is definitely an issue, but not always. As we know that, there are copyright restrictions up to a certain date and then after a certain date. So we can privilege the images that are already copyright available. However, it doesn't actually hurt to contact the person that provided the font to you, provided the archives to you, and ask them, are you willing to allow us to use this for educational purposes? This is what we're thinking of doing. And there were a few times I contacted people to do that, and they often said yes very quickly. In fact, the Dear Sadie exhibit, the photographs that we have of Sadie came from Sadie's family, and we didn't actually have a photograph until we were of her until about 3/4 of the way through the curation. I wasn't the curator, but of course finding that was important, and they wanted to be a part of it. So I would suggest that too. I'm just looking for. Do you have any tips for sparking interest among teachers who aren't history teachers but are teaching history and are boxed in by the curriculum and might not see the value of a program that doesn't hit their curriculum requirements but still teaches historical skill? This is a great question, and curriculum is a really funny thing because I've talked with teachers that in the same breath will say, I'm not restricted by the curriculum. The curriculum is very open. And for most of the provinces of Canada, that's actually true. The curriculum is very open. But then they'll say, I can't do that because the curriculum won't allow me to. Most of the things that prevent that work happening in the classroom. And here you highlighted that it might be teachers who don't teach history. But the thing that often boxes people in the classroom is their own narrative of history, their own understanding of what is important for people to learn and what is important for young people to learn in particular. And the young people in particular, especially if they are a multicultural population or a population that's at risk or a population that is working class, often the standards of what those students, what an educator believes those students should get are even more restricted. And so I would encourage you to use the historic space strategy, which I talked a little bit about at the beginning of the presentation, but you can find more information on my website, which is saying you spend one class going through a textbook and identifying all the curriculum requirements of names and dates and kind of big ideas. And then you spend the rest of your lessons, the rest of your unit, developing those skills by exploring primary sources and challenging that main narrative, that main historic space that you came up with. What this does is that, especially for teachers who aren't history teachers or who have that don't have a history background or have a limited interpretive understanding of history, it then puts the reins in the students' hands for the majority of the unit for them to interpret and for them to find meaning and differentiate that traditional historic space for the rest of the unit. So it takes the burden off a history teacher that often, through fear, through busyness, don't want to go any further because they just don't feel like they can. So a historic space strategy allows that to happen. I'll take one more question, and then we'll look at the time. The comments are amazing, but I'm just trying to differentiate questions and comments. I appreciate your statement. It hasn't all been about struggle. The curriculum can distort history to be about focusing just on crises. Francophones, First Nations, etc. only seem to appear on the textbook or curriculum linked in crisis and injustice. That's not a question, but I'm going to give you an answer to that anyway. I worked with a teacher, a great teacher, an award-winning teacher. Everyone loved her, who was really interested in doing social justice work. But when she talked about people of color to her students, she was a white teacher, and most of her students were black students with family ties to the Caribbean, although many of the students were actually Canadian by birth. Whenever she would talk about people of color, in order to bring students in, what she would say is, look, there's no black people in this photograph. Or look, there's only one black person in this photograph. Look at that. It's been really, really hard, right? And like the students, like black students, they know life has not been like a bed of roses. You don't need to tell them that. They already know that. But when you point out there's only one person there, for example, you're just saying that person is isolated. But that person is never isolated. a person has a family. That person will go home and they will celebrate and they will struggle, as we all do, but they'll be a part of community and they are moving forward with their lives. By highlighting one black soldier, you're not acknowledging his mother, maybe his wife, maybe his children, his brothers, his sisters, his father. We don't acknowledge those stories. But by bringing those stories in and saying, ordinary people, just like you and me, we are allowing our students to recognize that their ordinary lives can be a part of the narrative too, and not as a narrative of struggle, but rather as a narrative of presence and belonging, if we allow them to understand their experiences as being part of belonging. It's 3. Jessica, or do you want to close down at 3, or should we take another question?
We are going to wrap up. I know there are lots of questions that have been
so amazing
committed to the chat box, and I really hope you do take follow through with answering those questions on your website, and we would be happy to share those and include them and send them out to everybody who's registered for the webinar, so people don't miss out on hearing this. So do look for that. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Jessica, I just want to answer one question I see at the bottom, which was, when will my book be available? I spent last year writing it. It's with the publisher now. We don't have a final date, so keep my website, update that. But thank you for that question. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jessica.
That's quite all right, and I think that was a reasonable one to interrupt me for. And we will be happy to share when your book is available on our website and our social media as well. So we are wrapping up right now. I know everybody's getting back to work or trying to get some lunch in if they haven't had it already. So I do want to thank you again, Samantha, for your presentation. It was great to listen to, and it looks like everybody enjoyed it thoroughly.
That's great. Thank you so much for attending.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's webinar about using primary sources as a form of social justice. I have sent a link to the feedback survey in the chat box. It is now moving its way out of view with all the thank yous. So find that, and I'll also include it in my follow-up email. And you can fill out the survey there. So we always need feedback about our webinar so we can make the next series just as good or better. And for reporting purposes, we like to have some feedback. So in 2 weeks, we will be listening to Charles Howe and his presentation, Using Visual and Written Primary Sources to Teach Critical Thinking. So if you haven't already registered for that one, please do. And on that note, have a great day, everybody.